If you'd like to open to 1 Peter, we'll be in 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1, starting in verse 17. There was an American author, writer, and she was one time known for saying that she hasn't been everywhere, but that it's on her list. That I guess someday she will. She'll be everywhere. And that kind of reminds me a little bit of this section where Peter is essentially writing about the idea of people who are roamers. They're roaming. They have no certain home. They roam through life. Notice 1 Peter 1:17, he says, "If you call on the Father, who without partiality judges according to each one's work, conduct yourselves throughout the time of your stay here in fear, knowing that you were not redeemed with corruptible things like silver or gold from your aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. He indeed was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you, who through him believe in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God." And in this section, Peter is kind of building on what he talked about in the previous section, where if you remember verse 13, he says, "Therefore, gird yourself up." And we've looked at that about a month ago. The idea of girding is really the idea from Exodus, where Moses had told the people right at the end of the 10 plagues, when they're eating the Passover lamb and in preparation of leaving, and the destroyer was coming to kill all of the firstborn in Egypt. And Moses tells them, as you eat that meal, you are to eat it with yourself girded up, so that as soon as the time is right, you can open the door and walk out and leave Egypt and follow God to their inheritance, the inheritance that he had promised them. And so he starts off in verse 16 talking about how we are to be girded. We are to always be ready to answer God's call to follow him to an inheritance. No matter where it takes us, no matter what road it takes us down, we are always prepared. We're always ready to go wherever he tells us to go. And so in verses 17 through 21, he's really just building on that idea. He's going to describe the roamer's life for the truly girded at heart, the one who roams. But the way he describes it is interesting. He says that it's the one who is roaming without moving. They go anywhere, and yet they never go anywhere. And so tonight I'd like to look at how he describes that, the one who roams without moving. And he first describes it in verses 17 and 18 as the one who is roaming as, you could say it may be a true citizen. He says in verse 17, "If you call on the Father, who without partiality judges according to each one's work." And so we've kind of looked at this just a couple of weeks ago, I think. We were talking about calling on the Father, calling on the name of the Lord, the idea of sacrificing anything and everything that it takes in order to ask for God's help. That we say, we need your help, God, and so we're willing to do things your way in order to have your help. That's the same concept he's talking about here in verse 17. If you are calling on the Father, if you are telling him that you are happy to do anything and everything his way in order to have his help, then you'll lay all of yourself on the altar for that. Then he says the first step is recognizing that he is someone who, without partiality, judges according to each one's work. And the idea is there's really a choice to make here. Now, just briefly, I'll kind of remind us, we've been looking at 1 Peter for a few months now, just kind of section by section, and looking at some of the context of that as far as what happened when Peter wrote the book. This is the 60s AD, and not the 1960s, right? The 60s AD. When I say 60s, I think 1960s automatically, so I just assume you probably do too. The 60s AD, and you're looking at a Jewish rebellion in Jerusalem. You know, you have 70 AD when Rome came in and destroyed Jerusalem, and they destroyed the temple, and that's very well documented. But that wasn't a one-time event. It was led up to by 5 or 6 years of rebellion and battle and war. And so in the middle of all of that, there are Jews going all over the world saying, if you have anything to do with Judaism, you have to come back to Jerusalem. We are fighting for our homeland. We're fighting for this Messiah who's going to come sit on an earthly throne and reign forever from Jerusalem and overthrow Rome for us. We're fighting for all that God stands for because we're the Jews. We're special. We're different. And so Peter says, if you're really calling on the Father, if you really want his help, the first thing you have to recognize is, without partiality, he judges according to each one's work. This is without partiality, not based on race, not based on lineage, not based on Judaism or not Judaism. He doesn't have a favorite city. He doesn't have a favorite group of people. There's no one who's more important to God than anybody else. He judges each one just solely based on what you are doing, whether it's righteous doing or not righteous doing. And of course, there's more to it as far as the blood of Christ, and he'll get to that in the next couple of verses. But that's where he's starting, to recognize what God judges us on. And so he continues in verse 17, and he says, conduct yourselves with that information throughout your time of stay here in fear, knowing that you are not redeemed with corruptible things like silver or gold from your aimless conduct, received by tradition from your fathers. Now that's interesting to me, and here's why. He starts off the first part of this saying, if you call on the Father. And then he ends the second verse with this phrase, the aimless traditions you received from your fathers. And so again, a second time, you get this idea of a contrast, a choice that you have to make. There are the traditions of your fathers, and then there is the Father, the one who really we should care about what he says and what he approves of and doesn't. And the idea here is that they have a worldview that their dads gave them. Jerusalem is the place to be. It's going to be where God reigns from forever. And really, we all do. We all have a worldview that our parents gave us, things that they taught us, and sometimes those are really accurate, and sometimes they're not. And we are required to compare what our parents taught us to what God's word says to know, is this really accurate or not? And so he says, you have a worldview that comes from your fathers, and if you are more loyal to that than to the Father, you are going to make decisions that you will regret later. And so he encourages them to really consider that. And you know, what's striking to me about it is how he describes it at the end of verse 17 when he says, conduct yourselves throughout the time of your stay here with fear. And so that word for conduct, we think of maybe conduct, your actions, that kind of thing. But it really has the idea of somebody who is in a place that they don't belong and who has to watch really closely what they do. You know, we hear stories sometimes about people who come to America and they don't have a visa, they don't have a legal right to be here, and how careful they are about, what they do in order to not be discovered or something like that. They watch everything really closely. They try to stay out of people's vision and to stay out of the way. That's sort of the idea that he's describing here. A conduct that an alien has, a person has in a place they don't belong. And that's why he continues to say, conduct your stay here in fear. And there's that stay. Conduct your time here. And that's another word that has the idea of a temporary alien residence. Conduct your time as a foreigner here in fear. Now, not as a foreigner of any particular nation. I don't think anyone here is a foreigner to this nation. But in that sense, we are all foreigners in this world because it's not really our home. We're all foreigners on earth because, Satan is the prince of earth, and we don't align with him. He's the ruler of this world, the Bible describes him in sometimes, and we don't align with him because what we really align with is the true king, the eternal king. And so we see his realm, his nation, as the one that we align with most. And so he says, you are aliens here. And so we need to recognize that there's no home that's worth fighting for that hard here on this earth. The way that he describes this is interesting to me from the perspective of how people generally react to being a stranger somewhere. They've done studies and they found that if you're a teenager who is in a home that's dangerous, your parents are abusive or it's a dangerous place to be, and they'll sometimes, CPS or someone will come in and they'll take those teenagers out and they'll put them in a safer environment. If the teenager feels stressed, they almost always, if they have the opportunity, go back to the home where things were not good, where they were physically in danger. And it's a difficult thing, the way that the human brain is wired. We are wired to be attached to home, whatever that initial first thought of home was. And so if you're a Jewish person who's converted to Christianity and people start saying, Jerusalem is under attack, we have to save it, you are wired to want to do something about it. And that's true for all of us, whatever home might be. Sometimes home is people who have now a different religion than us because we've converted over. They have a different belief in who God is or how to worship God. And in a time of crisis, it's going to be your instinct to go back to it. Sometimes home is sin. Sometimes home is an addiction or a sin that you once were caught up in. And in a time of crisis, it's going to be your instinct to go back to it. And Peter is saying, maybe that's what you're going to feel like is the right thing to do. But in that moment, we recognize those places, family, sin, nation, city, anything, that's not really home because you are a stranger here. This is your time of stay here in fear. In chapter 2 and verse 11, he says, Beloved, I beg you as sojourners, as pilgrims, as people who have no home. Pilgrims are people who are going to a place that will be home, but they haven't gotten home yet. And so he's kind of hinting at that in verse 17. And so it's very much, I think, the idea of Psalm 84, verses 5 through 7. In Psalm 84, verses 5 through 7, the psalmist is describing when the Jews were in captivity away from Jerusalem. And he describes kind of how they felt about that and some of the difficulties. And he says, Blessed is the man whose strength is in you, strength is in God, whose heart is set on pilgrimage. Maybe we're away from where we want to be, but we are set on pilgriming to, on going to that place. He says, as they pass through the valley of Baca, and Psalm 84, 5 through 7, when he says valley of Baca, that's a reference back to David's lifetime, when right when he first became king, or in the first few years of his kingship, he went and he took Jerusalem from the people who lived there, but the Ark of the Covenant wasn't there yet. It was in Kirjath-Jearim. And so he goes, and you remember he tried to bring the Ark to Jerusalem, but what happened? They didn't do it right, and they put it on a cart, and it started to tip, and Uzzah put his hand up, and he caught it, and he died. And that was very devastating to David. And so he stopped, and they didn't move the ark anymore for a while until David started to see that the place where they left it was blessed. And he realized, okay, we still have God's blessing. And then, he was really excited to bring the ark all the way to Jerusalem. And it says he danced in the streets, and he embarrassed his wife. And it was a great time, And so all those events. Well, in the middle of all of that, while the ark is between Jerusalem and Kirjath-Jearim, they are in battles constantly in the whole area around that with the Philistines. And you read some of the Psalms, and it seems to very much be talking about the stress that they felt. The Philistines had originally stolen the ark back in Eli's time. They had stolen the ark from the Israelites, and so they're afraid it's going to happen again. And they're fighting battles here, and they're fighting battles there, and they feel like the ark is insecure. And when David finally wins those battles, he goes and he gets the ark, and he brings it back to Jerusalem. And this psalm seems to sort of speak about that. As they pass through the valley of Baca, that is literally mourning, when they're going through the place of mourning, they make it a spring. A spring is something that comes out of the ground and gives life. It gives medicinal help. It gives water to people. And so it's kind of this picture of, they cried so much from their mourning that springs are coming up from their tears, that they put their strength in God despite their difficulties, and God turned their tears into springs of blessings. The rain also covers it with pools, they said. They go from strength to strength, moving wherever they have to move. This is the people whose heart are set on pilgrimage. They go from city to city, from place to place, from whatever to whatever. And he says it's like they go from strength to strength to strength because the Lord is their strength. Each one appears before God in Zion. And it's this beautiful picture of what the heart of a pilgrim looks like. They are people who are willing to go wherever God is because God is their strength. And so they could live anywhere or live through anything. God is their strength. Now, I don't think Peter is really talking about actually having to move physical locations. That's not really the point here. The point is, wherever it is that you think you might need to go back to when you feel like you're in stress, whether that's a physical location or just a person or a sin or whatever it is, God can be your strength. You don't have to go back to error or to false things or to corrupt things because God is your strength. You can count on him. And he says, in particular, verse 17, that you're doing this in fear. Be afraid, he says, to move back to what you once knew, to go back to what you once knew. You have something much more precious now. Be afraid of going back to what you knew before and losing something precious. And really, that preciousness is what you see when you're looking at verses 19 through 20. He starts really in verse 18, and he talks about you were not redeemed with corruptible things like silver or gold. But he continues in verse 19, he says, not corruptible things, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. He indeed was foreordained before the foundation of the world. And again, you get this idea that there is a choice that the roamer, the pilgrim, is making here. Why roam to spoiled things, right? The corruptible things, the silver and gold. They wanted to go back to Jerusalem and fight to overthrow Rome. Right? What happens if you overthrow Rome and you're the ruler of the world? Gold and silver and riches and physical blessings. He says, those are corruptible things. The things in this life that seem appealing. For them it was that. For us it's something different. But whatever it is that seems so appealing, that's temporary, it's not worth fighting for. It's not worth making a fuss about. It's not worth working hard to have. But also, he says, why roam back to your earthly fathers when you can roam to the one who has always existed? Notice what he says in verse 20. He says, he indeed was foreordained before the foundation of the world. Foreordained, it's the idea of foreknown. It's two different words that are pushed together. One of them means before, and the other one means knowledge. And so literally it says, this is the one who was before knowledge, or the idea that he was known first. He was the first one to know. Before there were people or an earth or anything else to know, there was him. And so these people are thinking, this is what I was raised on. I've always been told that this is how it is. I've always been told that this is the way that things should be. My parents told me this. My grandparents told me this. My preacher told me this. In the synagogue on Saturday afternoons, I've always been told these things. And he says, but it's your whole life. That feels like everything, right? However old you are, your whole life can sometimes kind of feel like everything. Your family history, as far back as you know, the things that your family believes, that can kind of feel like everything. He says there's someone who is before knowledge, someone who is before everything else. Shouldn't his opinion count a little bit more than the opinion of family tradition, or what your family has taught you, or what your religious leader has taught you, or anything else like that? What really matters is what the one who has always existed says. And so they have this choice to make: corruptible things, incorruptible things. The tradition of our families, or the tradition, not tradition, but the knowledge of the one who pre-existed all of us, who was there before all of us. Which one are they going to choose? You know, I get way too invested in TV shows sometimes. I watch a TV show, and I just like obsess over it, and I get really interested in the characters and their lives, and I want to know what's going to happen to them, and I feel all their heartbreaks, and I get way too invested in TV and shows. In fact, Sarah was reading a book recently, and this lady talks about how she went out of town for a couple of days, and her husband kept her kids. He stayed home from work and kept their kids. And when she came back, he was relieved to go back to work, but he called her during the day, and he said, I'm glad you're back, but I really want to know what happens to Lisa on Days of Our Lives. Can you tell me? It's like he'd been watching her soaps, and he got all caught up in the course of 2 or 3 days. And so that's me. I get way too into TV shows. And so there was this one TV show that Sarah and I watched, and it's 5 seasons long, and the course of the TV show is that these two people start off not knowing each other and sort of like enemies, but they become a couple through the course of the show. And then somehow, and you watch them kind of grow together as a couple, and you get really invested in their relationship. And then somehow, in the very last episode, her memory is removed. She has some kind of traumatic experience, and she doesn't remember him anymore. And for 5 seasons, you've just watched them grow, and then suddenly they don't even know each other anymore. And I mean, I'm feeling like it's my own wife, and I'm just devastated by this and completely heartbroken. But I think that is kind of the idea that he's talking about here, that these people that he's writing to, they know Christ. They know the Father. They have a relationship with one another. They have this intimacy and this closeness that brothers and sisters in Christ should have. And yet some of them, are thinking about leaving it to go back to something that they knew before. Right? That couple, they were enemies to start with, and then in the end, they were enemies again. She went back to what she knew before. That's exactly what he's saying here. You're going to go back to this, something inferior, something less, something that's not as valuable, something that's not as good. You were bought with the precious, the unspotted, the perfect and blameless blood of Christ. Look at what all Christ did for you. It's worth it to him. Why isn't it worth it to you? It's so special. How could you ever think about going back to anything else besides what Christ has given you right here? And so he really encourages them. Be afraid to trust familiar promises, things that people have always told you that don't really line up with what God's word says, but they're kind of integrated into your core sense of being because you've always been told those things. Find those things, root those things out, recognize those things, know those things. Because when life gets hard, if you haven't rooted those things out, those are the things that are going to crop up in your mind first. And if you are not prepared to see them for what they are, you will just go right back to where you started and forsake everything that Christ has given you. And theirs was very extreme, leaving to move to a different place and rejoin an old religion. Ours doesn't have to be that extreme. It doesn't have to be so obvious. You can reject Christ and still be standing in this church building every Sunday morning. And so it's important to be careful and to be afraid to trust those familiar promises. We can go back just for a moment to Psalm 84. In Psalm 84, in verses 10 through 11, I really like the way that the psalmist says it there. As he's longing to be back in Zion. And remember, when we're talking about Zion, it's kind of this funny, tricky transition, right? Because he's talking about people who want to go to Jerusalem, to Zion, to fight for it. And he says that's the wrong thing to do. But then there are all these subtle references back to Zion. But remember how the New Testament thinks of Zion. Not a place, a people. We are Zion. And so, when you read the Old Testament and you read about, in the Psalms or places like that where it talks about Zion, first you should think of it as Jerusalem because that's how they thought of it. So to keep it in context, you have to think about it how they thought of it. But then if you're going to move it forward to the New Testament, you've got to translate it and think of it as us. The church is Zion. And so when they talk about that in Psalm 84, they were talking about the city. But if Jesus is talking about it or if Peter is talking about it here, he's talking about us. He's talking about the church. And he says in Psalm 84 in verse 10, a day in your courts, that's your temple, the place that you dwell. In chapter 2, Peter is going to say, we're the temple. The church is the temple. A day in your courts is better than 1,000 anywhere else. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of wickedness. I would rather be standing just outside of it than be inside in the comfortableness of another tent, of any other tent. Any other tent would be wickedness. I'd rather be just outside of it on the edge of what's happening than be in the center and the comfort of some other place. For the Lord God is a sun and shield. The Lord will give grace and glory. No good thing will he withhold from those who walk uprightly. This is the same psalm that said, walk uprightly, those who are set on pilgrimage. And so he wants them to roam like true heirs, to not forget what it is that they are promised, what Christ has done for them, and what they are going to inherit. But finally, he continues in verse 20, and he says, first he says he was indeed foreordained before the foundation of the world, but second, that he was manifest in these last times for you, who through him believe in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. This is the idea of roaming like a true believer, roaming like someone who's sincere, who really believes it. I like the way that Psalm 137 says it. Psalm 137 is a really heartbreaking psalm. And in Psalm 137, in verse 5, as they are outside of Jerusalem, rejected from Jerusalem, separated from Jerusalem and in Babylon, the writer says, if I forget you, O Jerusalem. Remember, today, that's you, that's me, that's us. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. I would rather have no job. I'd rather forget how to work and provide for myself and my family and do anything than forget about the people of God and the place that I belong in. He says, if I do not remember you, let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. I would rather never speak again. I'd rather not be able to open my lips or to express anything than to forget about the people of God and the preciousness of what God has blessed us with. And so they have choices to make, but he reminds them they were already chosen, and they were chosen as something valuable themselves. God sees them as valuable. That's when he says, don't roam to the fathers who didn't have Christ revealed to them. That's verse 20. He says, he was manifest in these last times for you. I think that's the emphasis there. Christ was revealed for you. The people who came before Christ, maybe they seemed like they knew a lot of things. Maybe they were very intelligent people. They didn't know Christ. They didn't have all of the information that we have. They didn't have everything available to them that we have. We are the ones who have that. And so he says, don't put your trust in them. He was revealed for you. He continues in verse 21, who through him believe in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory. The word for and, I think there really should be translated even. Who even gave him glory as he was dead. He was a dead person who got glory. What kind of dead people get glory? Once you're dead, and there's nothing really you can do about that, but he was raised and given glory even though he died. And so roam to the Father who can give glory to dead men, who can raise them up to life again. That's worth something. And then roam this world without allowing your hope to roam away from God. That he says your faith and your hope, no matter what happens, are in God. That wherever you have to go, whether that's physically go somewhere, or whether that's just to make a lot of changes in your life right here, whatever you have to do, whatever you have to change, wherever you have to go, remember not to undervalue yourself. Remember that Christ died for you. Remember that Christ